Welcome to Disestablishment 150 Dublin. The Church of Ireland was officially disestablished on the 1st of January 1871, meaning it no longer held any ties to the Church of England or to the state. We begin our tour in the grounds of the historic Christ Church Cathedral. Christ Church Cathedral was restored after disestablishment between 1871 and 1878 as an encouragement to the newly voluntary church. We meet Dr. Stuart Kinsella, Christ Church Cathedral Research Advisor, an expert on the fabric of the building.
So the restoration of Christ Church took place from 1871 to 1878, during which the cathedral was very largely rebuilt to produce this wonderful architectural gem that we have today. The cathedral was in a terrible state by the 1860s, in a physically very poor state. The saviour of Christ Church was Henry Roe, who in 1871, shortly after disestablishment had actually kicked in, he wrote a letter to the Archbishop and said, basically, I can give you carte blanche to restore it as you see fit. So George Edmund Street embarked on a remarkable restoration of the building, not just of the nave, but including the controversial demolition of the old long choir and replacing it with these very elaborate Eastern chapels and chancel area. Henry Roe had given an enormous amount of money to Christ Church. I think this was very largely in response to the fact that the Church of Ireland had been disestablished. And so Roe really wanted to give, he found Christ Church as the perfect opportunity to invest heavily in the church and have Christ Church not only restored, but to build a synod hall beside the cathedral. One of the most impressive things about the restoration of Christ Church was in fact the screen which was erected. It's a beautiful piece of carving which Street would have designed. And in fact, Street was such a hands-on architect that he designed literally every element within the cathedral, including the pulpit, the screen, the gates, the pews, the Archbishop's very, very elaborate throne, the cathedra, which makes it a cathedral. And all the details down to brasses and doorknobs. It was through the generosity of Henry Roe that the cathedral was fortunate enough to have such an elaborate Victorian restoration undertaken. And we're very fortunate to have a portrait of him which survives today in the music room. In fact, recently renamed the Henry Roe room. But poor Roe really bankrupted himself paying for the restoration of the cathedral. There was a huge amount of celebration in reopening the cathedral. And I think that also represented something which, if you like, bolstered the Church of Ireland after its rather traumatic disestablishment a couple of years earlier. And the attendance at this service was astronomical. There were people on the streets outside, so really it would have been quite a spectacle.
At the west end of Christ Church Cathedral, you can see an integrated stone bridge. This leads to the former Synod Hall of the Church of Ireland. After disestablishment, this Synod Hall was used for the Church of Ireland's General Synod and for the Dawson Synod of Dublin and Glendalough. It is now home to Dublinia's Medieval Exhibition of Dublin. The Synod Hall, built on the site of St. Michael's Church, was gifted to the Church of Ireland in the wake of disestablishment by the distiller Henry Roe, who also funded the restoration of Christ Church Cathedral. The move from the identification of the church with political alignments towards a focus on the church as a spiritual community conferred freedom for laity and clergy to develop a synodical way of life, democratic governance, and a partnership of laity and clergy. We are now standing in St. Audwin's Church. St. Audwin's is a medieval church with some 19th century furnishings. Its carved timber pews and pulpit dating to 1848 give us an example and an insight into an active Irish parish church at the time of disestablishment. St. Audwin's is the last surviving medieval parish church in Dublin. Its current form belies its medieval origins. Restoration works were carried out several times in the 19th century, including in 1826, 1848 and 1887. The pews and pulpit were designed by architect Joseph Welland. Welland designed and upgraded over 100 churches as architect of the Board of First Fruits and subsequently to the Ecclesiastical Commissioners, bodies which oversaw the funding, building and repairs to churches of the Church of Ireland. After disestablishment, many ancient churches not in use for worship were passed into the ownership of the state. St. Audwin's is an unusual site as not only is it under the guardianship of the Office of Public Works, it is also a parish church still vested to the representative church body where services are held as they have been here for 800 years. Here we are now in St. Patrick's Cathedral, founded in 1191. St. Patrick's Cathedral was extensively restored in the 19th century between 1860 and 1865. Due to the generosity of Benjamin Lee Guinness, of the famous Guinness family. This restoration, shortly before disestablishment, was seen as a sort of bulwark against the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. By the early 19th century, St. Patrick's Cathedral was near ruin. So much so, in fact, that demolition was considered. At the start of the century, some work was completed. However, with the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland looming, any substantial state investment following this seemed uncertain. Benjamin Lee Guinness personally undertook and paid for an enormous restoration of the building. The building was originally divided up into separate parts. The main change that was made by Guinness was to remove the interior divisions that would have existed, namely the walls, which would have divided the transepts from the rest of the building, turning the north transept into the chapel of St. Nicholas without, and the south transept into the chapter house of the cathedral. The stone pulpitum that separated the choir space from the rest of the nave was also removed. The choir stalls are used by the choir and by the cathedral chapter. From 1783 up until disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, they also served as a chapel to the Order of the Knights of St. Patrick. This order is represented by some of the banners and hatchments above the choir. After disestablishment, this order moved their ceremonies to Dublin Castle, and you can see some of their banners today in St. Patrick's Hall. At the west end of the cathedral, you can see a stained glass window known as the St. Patrick's window, as it depicts 39 episodes in the life and death of St. Patrick. This was installed during the Guinness Restoration period, made by the firm of William Wales & Co. in Northern England. This window was recently restored in 2004. In 1871, as a result of disestablishment, the Church of Ireland at its General Synod settled the two cathedrals issue, with St. Patrick's Cathedral becoming the national cathedral of the Church of Ireland and making Christ Church Cathedral the cathedral of the Dublin Diocese. Restoration and preservation is a constant concern for guardians of the cathedral, and a quirk of history, roughly 150 years after disestablishment, another massive restoration work is going on in St. Patrick's. This is the largest scale restoration project the cathedral has seen since the Guinness Restoration. We are joined by Gavin Woods, Cathedral Administrator, who tells us about the current restoration work in the cathedral.
There's a responsibility and a privilege in terms of our role here in the cathedral. We're stewards of the structure that has existed here for 800 years. Currently, at the moment, we're in the midst of a very large restoration project, conservation project, where we are working on replacing all the slates, lead works, etc. of the upper roofs of the cathedral. And when it's all over, what we really want to do is share the learnings here for the conservation community here in Ireland and also for the general public as well, because we strive all the time to let people understand, particularly domestic people here, Irish people, that this is their cathedral regardless of denomination, that they have a welcome here and that they will see their history and their cultural past, the footprint in time going back 1,000 years reflected in this structure as well.
Disestablishment was a time of political, social and religious changes in which a formally established church became a voluntary one. And walking through these buildings associated with that period really helps to flesh out this story and bring it to life in our times.